Hello, thank you for joining us at Yale Divinity School. I'm Bill Gettler, Dean of Ministerial and Social Leadership at Yale, and you are joining us for part of the Transformational Leadership series that's part of the Yale curriculum. We're very pleased this evening to welcome Reverend Eugene Cho, the President and CEO of Bread for the World, the collective Christian movement that seeks to urge our nation's decision makers to make moral decisions about hunger in the United States and around the world. Bread for the World addresses policies, advocates for programs, and gives language to those in government and those in the church in an effort to fight world poverty. Eugene studied at the University of California, Davis, and at Princeton Theological Seminary, and is ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church. For 2 decades, he first founded and then led Quest Church in Seattle, an exciting multicultural, multi-generational community of faith. In that ministry, he also spent a couple of decades doing grassroots organizing against poverty and seeking a more just society. It's that integration of Christian faith and ministry while offering leadership in a hurting society that we are exploring during this weekend-long seminar. We began this afternoon with a group of students from both the Divinity School and from the School of Management at Yale. We've had an exciting beginning to that conversation, and we look forward to continuing it with you this evening, Eugene. Welcome to Yale. We're so glad that you're here.
Well, thank you so much to you, and thank you again for all the students that are joining us on a Friday night and all those that are joining us online as well.
We titled this conversation, Pandemic, Insurrection, and Violence, What Transformational Leadership Means During Tough Times. That's quite a title, pretty intense sermon title it would be, I think, even during the season of Lent. But it suggests a lot about your work and ministry. So perhaps we could begin asking you to tell us a little bit about what moved you from perhaps a more traditional minister's life into engagement in the most challenging issues of our time.
Well, first of all, gosh, I thought we were going to be talking about Seattle sports. That would be a lot easier. But you're right. Those conversations are definitely real topics and real issues. But I'm going to answer this question as honestly as I can, because I think the students deserve it and you deserve it. I made the decision to transition from a local church pastor, which has its beautiful things and challenging things, as you know, and went through a long season of discernment along with my wife and loved ones about an opportunity to join Bread for the World. That decision was made before the pandemic and before the insurrection and before the most contentious modern-day election in U.S. history, before the rise of anti-Asian hate, and the list goes on. As I look back, I think if I'm honest, if I knew all of those things were going to happen, I don't think I would have taken the job, if I'm being just bluntly honest. And I actually, even in the course of my life, as a Christian, as someone like others wanting clarity from God about my future, I'm really grateful that God has never given me the kind of clarity about my future that I've always sought and wanted. I want the GPS style of my future. But that has never transpired. And I think in many ways it's because in certain moments of my life, I just don't have the depth or the maturity to understand all that's going to happen. So for that season of 2019, I'm really grateful that the values that drove us, my wife and I, it led us to this decision to say yes to Bread for the World. And that yes has helped us to be present and persistent and prayerful, even as we're going through some of the most challenging things we've ever gone through as a nation, but even for myself as an individual, helping navigate Bread for the World. I mean, some of the most challenging things. And the reality is we're all, and by those who are watching online, those that are here, there are going to be moments of great joy, But there's going to be tremendous tests for us as communities, but also as individuals. And I'm reminded of how important it is that we know who we are, what we're about, like our values. And then for me as a person of faith, like who I desire to serve. So those things have really helped during two of the most difficult and challenging years, at least for me in my leadership. But grateful to be here. Yeah.
So let's just go a little deeper there. What were the challenges you anticipated? If you could kind of reflect on those briefly, and then what are the real challenges?
Sure.
What does it come to be?
Sure. Well, so whenever we make decisions, especially macro decisions that are impacting our future, we're all going to do our due diligence. We're going to research and analyze careers, jobs, new seasons and opportunities. So obviously, I was familiar with Bread for the World because as a church pastor, we've partnered with them. The offering of letters have always had tremendous respect for Bread for the World. So it's also not rocket science to know that we're living in polarizing times. That didn't begin 2 years ago. That's been around now for some time. So I knew that the climate, the landscape was going to be challenging. I didn't quite realize that what you read and absorb is a little different when you're actually swimming in those waters. And because much of Bread's work is working with not just other NGOs or government agencies, but we're literally working with members of Congress. And it's an incredibly polarizing time. It's unlike what I could have imagined, which has been exacerbated by the elections, the insurrection, the contesting of the election results, and then you add a global pandemic to this. I think anyone that's watching or listening, we could all acknowledge there is no way that we could have anticipated what the last couple of years would have been like. So that's been really tough. I think despite that, we have a vision. We have a mission, which, whether now or later we'll get more to, and it's to help end hunger. And we want to acknowledge and celebrate people that are doing tremendous work directly, whether it's food banks or church pantries and people that are getting involved on a direct level. But we also believe that the government, as a nation, there's a moral obligation, a moral conviction that we need to do something as well. And legislation that we're advocating for has the capacity to enable not just the one, not just the family, but millions and millions of people to be uplifted out of poverty, hopefully onto a path towards what we would say theologically towards flourishing and not just merely survival.
I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about what it takes for people who are led by their faith to move not only into that public realm, but to claim a voice that has some authority.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in many ways, authority doesn't come just by title. It doesn't come just by our degrees. I don't want to rain on anyone's parades here. We have lots of Yale students. There's a fruit to your studies, your testing, your tuition, and things of that nature. But I also think that it's not just about those things. I would say that it's about us embodying our values and convictions. It's us living it out. It's a personal thing. From a church perspective, yes, we're called to have a pastoral voice and a prophetic voice, but when it's not accompanied by a personal embodiment of these things, then we become like a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And I just think that we need leaders that not just have the degrees and the pedigrees and the relationships and the social connections. Those things have value and merit, that have expertise, but we also need the moral grounding to be able to speak onto these things, not as perfect citizens or perfect leaders, but I think with the level of authenticity and vulnerability, someone that has credibility, not just because of their degrees, but also because of their very living, their very embodiment. I think this is the reason why, not to get too Jesus-centric, but there's a reason why I think Jesus defies so much of the religious established order, and yet people kept listening to this person because there was a certain sort of sincerity, authenticity, power that was unlike the power structures to be. And so it's a challenge, but an important invitation for all of us.
Earlier this afternoon, you took the class through a bit of an exercise of defining leadership and thinking about what would be transformational about, what might be transformational about leadership and why. Would you talk about that a little bit? What was central to that for you, that
Sure.
exercise and the answers that they came up with and that you led us toward?
I don't think this is news to anyone that's watching or listening. If you were to Google leadership, you're not going to be short of resources that are out there. There are lots of leadership books. I'm embarrassed to say I'll probably add to it next year, a leadership book about vulnerability and transformational leadership. But I think part of the reason why there are so many books around leadership is because it matters. Leadership matters. And I think we're all, whether or not we're a CEO of an organization or the dean of Yale Divinity School or we founded a company, every single one of us have influence, every one of us. So I think we're learning, how do we utilize our giftings in a way that not just lead projects and initiatives from A to B, but also lead in a way that makes the world more just and more equitable, more beautiful, more compassionate. I think we realize that we want to not just be about the bottom line as the world defined it, but there's something about helping reimagine a more beautiful world, which is the reason why I think we need a descriptive like a transformational leadership. Because maybe leadership by itself lacks context and substance, in my opinion. So I think there are people who have power, who have authority, who may have leadership positions, and yet they're using it or abusing it, not necessarily for transformational, but they're using it perhaps to denigrate others for the purpose of elevating themselves. That's toxic, it's dangerous, it's abusive, it's not God-honoring. And so I think we have to help people explore, or the word that the word that I've been using a lot is to reimagine. And that requires some deconstruction, things that maybe we're accustomed to or that we've been a part of, to have the courage to deconstruct and then to reimagine a new way, a different way of doing things. The word deconstruction is very vogue nowadays, and I suspect that here at Yale, a lot of students are talking about it. I think one of the greatest deconstructionists was Jesus. He was often heard saying, "You once heard it said," and then he begins to give a different interpretation of what the kingdom of God is about. You once heard it said, this is what status quo is, even in religious circles. I love that. He's not abandoning Old Testament, the Pentateuch. He's not abandoning these things, but helping to unveil what was lost in the essence, I think, of what it meant to be a follower of Yahweh, of God. So that's what I mean by transformational leadership.
Let's talk about the relational piece for you. You speak personally about your own systems of support and collegiality and family. Tell us a little bit about how it is that you do this work alone and how it is that you do it with others at your side.
Yeah, it's a great question and a hard question. Gosh, I feel like I'm speaking to my therapist here. Because it's really, really good. And so if I feel like I'm kind of squirming
it's just us, really.
Yeah. As you know, my wife is a therapist, and it's a conversation that we've been having a lot. And this is my attempt to be vulnerable in front of these students here. I want to encourage people here that as we're assessing things that are meaningful and valuable for us, community should be one of those assets that we deem as not just an elective, but utterly essential to human thriving and flourishing. As a minister, that became busy and pastored a large church with a large budget and traveled the country and around the world doing things here and there, I think there were things that I sacrificed because I was so busy. And as I transitioned away from the church, I realized that I didn't really have a lot of friendships. I knew a lot of people.
Yeah.
I knew a lot of folks that were important and influential, but when it was all said and done, in moments of like great personal anxiety and seasons of, yes, mountaintops, but valleys as well. Of course, there's my wife and my children, but those relationships have their meaning, but I realized that my community. It's really interesting that I think whether in our broken penal system or in just the sad reality of war, one of the cruelest things that we do to human beings is called isolation or solitude. And the reason why we do it, and the reason why some people deem it as effective, is because it is antithetical to how God designed us. So think about that for a second. Solitude or isolation is punishment for our soul, and that's what we do to punish others. And we know this because it's not what God intended. It's like sleep. I think sleep is tremendously spiritual. And sometimes we struggle with it because all is not well with our soul. God designed us to rest and to Sabbath. So your question is provocative for me because I think we're on a regular basis, all of us go through seasons where we need to recalibrate. So I'm going through a season of recalibration where I realize I don't just need a community of people that work for me. I'm their boss. They treat me well. Most of them do. You know who I'm talking about, the one that isn't? I'm staring at the camera right now. I've got my relationship with my children and my parents, and I love them to death, but it's different. And so I'm recalibrating it, and you know, my answer is, yes, I agree with you. Yes, we can't do this alone. And part of it is because it was never meant to be done alone. And here's the last point that I want to make. It's a proverb that some of you might be familiar with. It comes from East Africa. My friends who live in Tanzania claim it as their own. While it's popular in some circles, others might not know it. It's really powerful, and it goes like this. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I've experienced going fast, but I'm realizing the race is not to the swift. It's a marathon. And I am so eager to share this, particularly with younger sisters and brothers, younger students, as you're setting forth. Like even right now, think and ponder and imagine the marathon. And think about who you get to do this life with. And it'll be so much more meaningful, joyful, impactful, life-giving.
So Bread for the World has been at this for a while, through a variety of political seasons, with changing leadership. What's the story for now? What's the environment right now for this work?
Sure. Bread for the World, for those that are hearing about it for the first time, bread.org is our URL. We would love for people to check us out, learn more about us. It's a very unique organization. I think for some Christians, we're very comfortable, and our sweet spot is compassion. It's the food banks, the church pantries, it's direct relief, all very important and beautiful things. Bread for the World started about 46 years ago. Its founder, his name is Art Simon. God bless him. He's still with us and still continues to send me notes of encouragement and prayers, he and his wife. And how it started is that he, as a pastor, as he was looking at his congregation, there were people that were hungry, experiencing the realities of poverty and hunger. Now, we all know that there's complexities and nuances to it. As he began to chat with other of his colleagues who were in ministry, both Catholics and in the Protestants, there were very similar stories. So 7 Protestant leaders and 7 Catholic leaders got together, and they realized that they needed to do something beyond what they were already doing, that they needed to get to the root, to explore systemic and structural things and urging the government to do its part. And that's how Bread for the World started, as a national movement. When you speak to the climate that exists in right now, it is hard. And it's not just me as a newbie coming into the space. Like almost every single person that I speak to that have been working in DC will say they've never experienced anything like this. So there are some big challenges and tremendous work for us to do. But we have to make sure that we're not going to succumb to the demonizing, the polarization, the partisanship that's going on, to keep elevating the real stories of men, women, and children, both in our nation and around the world, working as a nonpartisan organization, working in bipartisan ways to advance this legislation. Here's the hopeful thing and the good thing. I have not met any person in government, in DC, that says, I don't like people that are experiencing hunger. We don't meet anyone that calls their members of Congress to say, we don't like you supporting hunger programs. The methodology is different. The solutions and ideas are different. And so we're still experiencing, particularly with our global international efforts, we're still experiencing some good, solid bipartisan support. Right now, we have a bill that we've been supporting and advocating and championing called the Global Malnutrition Prevention and Treatment Act. If it gets passed, let me say that again, when it gets passed, we've been working on it now in different forms for 3 years. It will literally impact tens of millions of people, especially women and children. But that's an example that there's no easy overnight answers. You've got to keep showing up. The persistence, the presence, every single day working towards these things, driven by data, organizing, good research, relationship building, being respectful and civil, and then ultimately developing the grassroots political will to move something together. So it is discouraging, but we're still here. Bread continues to lead with great credibility and respect, and ultimately continuing our mission to help end hunger.
Do people in places of power and decision-making, like the ones you're talking about, do they act as you expect them to act, or do they surprise you?
Let me make sure no one else is watching. This is a tough one. Yes and no. Right? Because I think it's inaccurate to share one broad thing about every single member of Congress. I think there are some folks that I'm really grateful for their service. They're public servants. I may disagree with them. They may not support us on some of our domestic or international efforts, but I'm grateful that they're committed to public service. I also think that there are some folks that have lost the spirit of public service, that it almost feels as if, how do we go viral? I hate to say it that way, but I would love for them, to be more deeply connected to their work and to their constituents. I also think that there's something dangerous about our political system when we're not leaving room and space for those who are experiencing hunger and poverty. So let me just give you one example. Last year, or I believe in the year 2000, when the last year in which statistics about the amount of money that was spent on lobbying in the United States, the industry that spent the most money on lobbying in the US, I'm just going to pause for a second for you to just guess in your mind, it's pharmaceuticals. Okay. The number one company, like one singular company, pause for dramatic effect, just make a guess, was Facebook. As you know, they've been in a lot of trouble. I think in a system of democracy, I get it, that people have the freedom to lobby and advocate for these things. But my challenge to those that are here, our students and those who are listening online, watching, is that it almost feels as if you need clout, power, and money to have your voices heard, which then lends itself to the question, how are we listening to our neighbors in our nation and around the world who are struggling with poverty and economic viability? There is no room, or hardly much. I think this is the reason why Bread for the World exists, and why we're trying to, imperfectly, but trying to come alongside with humility, trying to be at the table when conversations and decisions are being made, where we're trying with dignity, sharing the reality, the plight, the stories of our neighbors here, and certainly our neighbors globally as well. Yeah.
I want to follow up with one more question about this, but I want to tell the students who are here that we'll turn to you next for your questions. So if you'll make ready and be ready to ask Eugene some questions. So one of my experiences with Bread over the years has been the advocacy work of congregations I've loved and been part of, in which congregations are asked to step into sort of a leadership role, really, to claim some authority and to at least be in conversation with some leaders. Would you talk a little bit about that level of Bread's work of engaging broader communities?
Yeah, and if I can step back just for a little bit, I think part of what we're trying to do at Bread for the World is to not shy away from the moral voice and the moral courage that we have as people of faith. When you look at the scriptures, a pursuance, a commitment to justice is not a tertiary issue. It's not an elective. It's not a one-credit class that you take on a Friday night. Sorry, folks, inside joke. It's not a clothing accessory that you wear in season or off season. The prophets in the Old Testament actually say that justice itself is worship of God. Like, our worship of God is incomplete without a parallel commitment to justice. And he's actually speaking not just to the wider community, the prophets, but also to the religious community themselves. So I think this is an important time for Bread for the World, yes, to speak to our elected leaders, speak to the larger culture, but also to speak to the Christian community, to the wider church, during a time where we're wrestling with how white supremacy and things are embedded into the church, where we're talking about cultural Christianity, where we've seen, as you and I spoke of earlier this morning, just grieving how there were people of faith taking symbols that are sacred to us in the name of Jesus, attacking, rioting on the Capitol building. So I think this is an incredible time to continually remind the church who we are, that our ethics comes not from cultural Christianity, but from the ethics of Christ as shaped in the Beatitudes especially. And as a church then, to remind others, including elected leaders, that we want to lead with moral vulnerability, a moral courage, a prophetic voice, if you will. And again, because Scripture is so clear that God has an inclination for those on the margins, the forgotten, the poor, the hungry, the orphans, and the widows, that when we do and pursue those things, man, it brings a certain, I think, authority to the church and credibility to the church, because it means that we are what we believe and what we profess and we say. So I am simply urging, and Bread for the World, we're urging women and men, people of faith, to live into who we say that we are. And by urging our lawmakers, because they should listen to their constituents about things that we value. And that's why the offering of letters, which you referenced, is so important. and to encourage people of faith that it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, a healthy thing, a right thing to become responsible citizens, urging and working for the common good of our society.
Thank you. Who has a question?
Hi, Eugene. I want to ask you about faith and politics. Over the past few years, I think the rise of Trumpism has been closely associated with the support of the evangelical community. In many ways, it has united a lot of people. In other ways, a lot of people, me included, have become more skeptical of the faith community and what it represents. So as more and more younger people are becoming less religious, what are your thoughts and what do you think is the future of faith and politics in today's contentious society?
Yeah. All right, well, next question. No, it's great. X, thank you. That's a great question. Let me first do a very self-serving thing and share with you that, and with others that might be watching or listening. It's something that I have wrestled with, have written a book on, in essence, on that very topic. I have been blasted on people on both sides of the aisle on how I engage the former president. In my book, you know, I don't want to demonize him. At the same time, I think his actions are antithetical to the gospel, antithetical to what we believe as Christians. But I think what you're speaking to is the dissonance. Like the dissonance between, I get it, whether I agree, I don't agree, I get it why there are some who would support Trump or Trumpism. I think the dissonance is when people of faith who claim values that are important to us, and yet we see consistently action that does not corroborate those set of values. And at that point, you begin to realize, where's the dissonance? And how could that be for people that speak about family values in one generation, and yet when those things aren't modeled, when we hear language and rhetoric that he uses that, again, would be something that would probably require discipline within the church. So, I mean, I would agree that it's an area of great dissonance and challenge. I have wrestled and I have struggled. I have wrestled with it not just on my own, but as I engage other leaders and other pastors who think very differently to better understand where they're coming from and how they're coming from. A couple more thoughts that come to my mind is, I think this is an important time for us to have the courage to call out that which needs to be called out. And on both sides, but certainly as you're speaking about Trumpism, I think it's really important that even as we say we want to be about civility and politeness, civility and politeness does not mean that we should not prophetically call out that which is wrong. And I think this is an important time for folks to do that. The second thing that I would say is, and I write about this in the book, is about the dangers of cultural Christianity. In a nation that professes, at least on paper, statistically, a high population of people that still say they believe in God and are Christians, I think what we're really gauging is not necessarily people who take their faith seriously, but it's a form of cultural Christianity that's more infatuated with, I think, a guise of Christianity and not necessarily the ways of Jesus. And that sounds really judgmental, and I get that, but I think there's still room for us to pastorally and prophetically claim and say that there's a distinction between those two things. Let me give an example, historically. And in the class tomorrow, I'll speak more to this, but just for the time being, it is stunning when you discern the role of the German church in the rise of Nazism. It is stunning, it's sobering, and it's absolutely terrifying. One historian claims that approximately 93% of the German church were in support of Nazism. I mean, how do we connect the dots of that kind of dissonance? 3 years ago, right before the pandemic started, I was leading a group of pastors and leaders on a trip to Rwanda to learn about reconciliation, truth-telling, peacemaking, confession, and it was also marking the 25th year mark post the horrific Rwandan genocide. Again, we don't have the time to go into all of this. About 1 million people died. 1 million people died, Hutus and Tutsis. The Rwandan genocide began approximately 4 or 5 days after Resurrection Sunday. Rwanda then professed to be about 91 to 92% professing Christians. There are stories of husbands killing their wives who were of a different ethnic clan. There are stories of pastors who locked the doors of their churches and had members of the other tribe. I say this not to just judge other people, but I think it's really an opportunity as a nation, as Christians, as people for the common good. We've got to do some serious introspection and examining of our hearts. And I think it does also, it begins with addressing what's going on, but I also think that there's something more, and I'll close with this as a long-winded answer. I think politics has grown to become the pervasive idolatry of our time. And research right now is showing us that one's political affiliation has now grown to become the main lens by which we see other people. There's a word for that. It's called idolatry. And so even right now, like, we can just judge one another by how we see ourselves politically. That feels incredibly dangerous. So there's the issue of Trumpism we've got to talk about, but I think there's another topic about political idolatry that exists in our time. Politics matter. I don't think it's the lens by which we should be worshiping others and ourselves. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Woo, let's talk Seattle sports.
I'm going to give you a softball. You had hinted at, the challenges in being prophetic in your forward guidance between your previous responsibilities, maybe where you were projecting out membership and pledge numbers, and now, you're accountable to a board of directors, and you've got sponsors, and, you have to be prophetic in a different way, and there is no, I can't answer that, or there's no answer to that. You have to have numbers. So can you speak to the tension that exists and the different kind of hats that you wear when you're giving this forward guidance?
Sure. It's a very interesting question from a divinity student that I would have expected from our School of Management. But I think it speaks to the fact that you come from your unique background of business. And so, I think it's a great question. And I actually wish at Princeton in divinity school that there was a class on like economics and business and the practicality of things. Because one of the most dangerous phrases that Christian leaders love to abuse is, if you build it, they will come. What? Hey, where is that found in the Bible? Because it's not there. Obviously, we need faith, but I think we could also use a lot of information on the 101s about metrics and numbers and budgeting and pro forma budget and speaking to a board and all of these things. I do have numerous responsibilities, as I'm sure each of you do. Part of it engages the board. Part of it is being the spokesperson for Bread for the World. Part of it is relationship building with members of Congress. I find it to be a burden and a challenge and an invitation to speak with senators and members of Congress as well. Fundraising is a huge part because you need capital in order for us to keep doing what we're doing, and that's a huge part. For those that are watching, become a monthly donor. Just in case board members are watching, I've got to say that at least once. Become a monthly donor at any amount. So all of those things are important. But here's my answer. I don't ever want to betray myself and my values. And at times, it means that you are engaging things that feel disruptive or difficult. Let me give you 2 examples. This is crazy. My first day at Bread for the World in the onboarding process, I overlapped with David Beckman, my predecessor, for 3 months. He was a gracious president helping. But my first day, I decided to respond to a tweet by President Trump. Respectfully, not that he's going to read my tweet, but I tweeted respectfully because I, as some of you may know, even before the anti-Asian rise of rhetoric and violence, that was something that our community knew and felt and experienced way before it hit the main airwaves. So when he began to call it the Chinese virus, took me an hour to formulate my thoughts, and I responded to that tweet. I had no idea that it would go viral. Viral to the point that the next day the Washington Post covered it, New York Times. I mean, it was all over the place. My first day on the job. The Washington Post, who writes their own headlines, wrote a headline that some of my board members were concerned about. It's like, an evangelical pastor condemns President Trump. That was a couple of difficult conversations, but I don't want to betray my values. My desire is not to demonize or vilify people, but when appropriate. My first day officially on the job, wow. I and Bread for the World got on every single newspaper, almost, I would say at least 300-400 publications around the world. Media requests from anyone and everyone, ended up just doing one interview with NPR, because you got to show NPR some love. And it was because I had to ask one of my board members to step down because of an unfortunate situation. It's probably not the best time here to go into the depths of it, but I think collectively, as an organization, as board members, we're all trying to do the right thing, and at the same time to make sure that we're embodying the very values that in our earlier session that we were trying to say we want to be about. But it's challenging. One of the phrases that I have been saying to myself and to others a lot, leadership is not for the faint of heart. Be really wise and careful what it is that you want and covet. Because leadership, as you're guiding people with vulnerability and courage, pastorally, prophetically, personally, is not for the faint of heart. Yeah.
Is that a test of leadership? Do you think that somebody who's offering real leadership should at times feel like they're at that edge?
I think you're right. I think nobody wants to be tested, but I think it happens, and we have to rise to it with vulnerability and at times imperfection, knowing that you're always going to disappoint people along the way. But yeah, I do agree, which is the reason why, even though I say it's not for the faint of heart, it also means that we don't have to have all the answers at all times. And sometimes that's the kind of vulnerability that I think speaks to the kind of leadership that we need in our world today.
Thank you, Eugene. I want to show you a little bit of Seattle love because you've been asking all night. So first question, will the Sonics come back to Seattle eventually? And two, as we're entering this Lenten season, as we consider our mortality, as we ultimately think about Jesus' death and then resurrection, how are you thinking about those themes as they relate to everything that's going on in the world right now?
Wow. You know you're in a divinity
It's a
school,
divinity school, what can
when
I
you
say?
get that kind of question. Well, let's get to the more important question first about the Seattle Supersonics. That hurts. You asking that question, that in itself hurts. And this is an inside story. I probably shouldn't share it for the interwebs, but I'm going to anyways, because YOLO. I once spoke at Starbucks.
A Starbucks or
The Starbucks. I once spoke at the Starbucks with the CEO. His name is Howard Schultz, who purchased the Seattle Supersonics and then eventually sold the Supersonics. One of the clear instructions that we were given as part of their speaking series is that we could not mention that aforementioned team because it was a source of. So yes, they will come back at some point. To the very important question about Lent, the Lenten season, just this past Wednesday, during Ash Wednesday, as ashes were applied to us, and to hear those words, that we are from dust, and to dust we shall return. Certainly, I think it's a reminder of all of our own mortality, but I don't take a fatalistic perspective. We're all going to die, and so it's just the way that it is. For me, yes, there's power in the resurrection and power in the good news, but I'm also very mindful of the tyranny of death, the tyranny of injustice, the tyranny of suffering that should not be. And because of what we see clearly in Ukraine, in 1 week we have now surpassed 1 million refugees, and it's only going to be increasingly significant. But I think we should also acknowledge the Black and brown nations and communities that have been suffering for some time, that hasn't captured the consciousness of governments or even the larger populace. Yemen comes to mind. Yes, we're aware of Afghanistan because it was recent, but Yemen, Ethiopia, Tigray, I think about Syria, I think about what's going on right now in Myanmar, Bangladesh. There's so many places, and it's overwhelming. And yes, I'm grateful that the gospel is an antidote and gives an answer to these things. But I hope never in a fatalistic way that the church just stands idly by and says, we will do nothing. I'm reminded, I'm going to just take out my phone for a second. I'm reminded of a quote that I often reference, and I don't want to butcher it, so I'm going to read it here. It's from a theologian that I admire, one that divinity students should be familiar with. His name is Jürgen Moltmann. Wrote a book, a seminal book on hope called The Theology of Hope. And a lot of people, both in the faith communities and in the secular community, they're asking me about hope. Like, what gives you hope? And his definition of hope, for me, is brilliant, but it's also very, very provocative and honest. This is what he says. He says, genuine hope is not blind optimism. It is hope with open eyes, which sees the suffering and yet believes in the future. That's the kind of hope that we need in our leadership and perspective.
We need a woman's voice. Which women in the class have a question? That's on the spot, isn't it? Please.
Hi. You have spoken several times. You've mentioned you cannot betray your values. Everything has to be about the values. Could you please share with us what those values are? And would you tell us whether or not we should engage in those values as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah. Man, you sound like a lawyer that understands. And for those that are watching online, it's because Jessica is a lawyer. You know, it's a great question. And here's first my comical attempt to answer it, and then a more honest answer. You know, when you tell people your values, and then you're held accountable to those values, which is the reason why I think there's sometimes reticence for people who tell you. I've actually spoken with consultants that would tell you, you don't want to publicize what your values are. Because once you put them on paper, then you're going to be held accountable to those values. So I think there's both personal values and then there's organizational values. For Bread for the World, we've gone through a lengthy process where I know Bread for the World, as a 46-year-old organization, has a set of values. Some of it is written in places, and some of it is not written. And one of the first things that I did is wanting to gather those resources and then write them down to almost codify it and say, are these values consistent to who we are? And tomorrow I'll share those 7 values because I don't want to take the time here, but there's 7 values that we said, these are the values that are going to shape us. What's really interesting about these values, both for Bread for the World and some of the personal values, many of them which I share, is that in many ways, they exist in tension to one another. So I don't want you or others to think that these are like just hunky-dory, amazing things that never intersect or at times feel as if they're in tension to one another. I'll give 2 examples real quick. One of our values is like prophetic courage. Woo! Another value is nonpartisanship. If you can just imagine some of the tension that those things can feel. Because if this isn't being recorded and all of you signed an NDA, I could probably want to just go off a little bit on some conversations. But it wouldn't contribute, I think, to our spirit of wanting to build relationships in a nonpartisan style with different parties. Now, again, it doesn't mean that we can't let anything go. The board member I asked to step down was a member of Congress. It was a pretty big deal, which is the reason why it hit news. So what I'm realizing and learning is, how do we be faithful in tension? That's my imperfect answer to your question. For me, it's about trying to be present, persistent, and faithful in the tension of these values that serve as parameters. So personal values, it's all of the things that I'll share tomorrow. And then there's a couple verses for me as a person of faith. Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? To seek justice, to love mercy. I actually like another translation's version, to embrace kindness and to walk with humility. It has been a moral compass for me, especially during a time when I think it's really tempting for Christians to elevate pastoral or prophetic without acknowledging the other and to do it with humility. Sometimes I share my concern with pastors who are all about being pastoral and have abdicated the call to be prophetic because they know it's going to be disruptive to their congregations. Simultaneously, I'm concerned about leaders who are all about being prophetic, but we've lost the spirit of love. And because we choose to congregate with other people that are just like us, it becomes a cacophony of just a resounding gong of prophetic voices, And if we don't have love, we won't really know because we're an acquirer of that. And then to do all of that with humility, which is the reason why, again, I hate to sound overly preachy, which is the reason why I think for me, as a follower of Jesus, placing Jesus at the center of everything, including our moral work of justice, is so important. So I'll stop there.
So we're with a class of graduate students who don't get to spend very long in graduate school. They're thinking about the things after this time. What should they have their eye on to become transformational leaders? What do you think they should be looking out for?
So Bill, you're asking me to give some advice to these graduate students. Many of them will soon be graduating and entering the real world. It sucks out there.
Don't leave.
No, not at all. I mean, gosh, this is a hard one because it's a hard one, but it's also a real personal one.
Yeah.
We have 3 grown-ish children, one that just graduated from college, is embarking on her first career. This is what I would say. Be wary of anyone that gives you one advice and advertises it as the most important advice. And I actually mean that very seriously. I don't think there's one most monumental, most significant advice. And I think in many ways, transformational leadership changes and morphs and transforms from chapter to chapter of our lives. What was, I think, most relevant to me when I was 24, coming out of grad school, is not necessarily the most monumental for me right now. But if I can give some advice, I would encourage you to embrace the whole person of who you are. I think that's really important and one that I wish I had heard more of. Not because I was influenced by others. I think I chose to only filter one lens, and that one lens was, I gotta get out there, I gotta accomplish, I gotta achieve, I gotta do, and I get to. It was all about just trying to get to the next part of the rat race. And I think in that process, while I achieved and I accomplished, I missed out on building really significant friendships and community. I was sharing with someone earlier that if I had to do college over again, I wouldn't have graduated early. I would have stayed my 4th year. I would have invested it in relationships and friendships. I think it's a huge indicator that as I look back at my college years, I don't have a single friendship from my college years. That's sad. Thankfully, in grad school, things changed a little bit, but about mental health and wellness, about embracing Sabbath, that resting, coming from an immigrant mentality. Again, I don't want to make a sweeping generalization about all immigrants, but my parents are part of an immigrant generation that worked and worked and worked, and they, to this day, don't know what rest means. And I don't want to live in this way. That when Christians speak about spiritual well-being, we're not just talking about church attendance and reading the Bible. I think those things are really important, but I think it's to really embrace our full bodies, our full mind, our full self. That would be what I would encourage my younger sisters and brothers here to be mindful of as you engage in the next chapter.
Friends, will you join me in thanking Eugene Jarrett for being with us?
Thank you.
Thank you.